All right. I think that we are alive and ready. Let's just say the recording is going, I'm going, and you're all here. Actually, one thing I'm going to do, because I am a belt and suspenders kind of guy, and I've been burnt too many times, so I'm just going to set this up to record the audio only side. Sorry. Sound recorder. Recording? Very nice, very nice. All right, so that sits over there. It'll probably kill the battery, but at least I'll save some of it just in case the computer fails. It's out. Good afternoon, everyone. It is really quite wonderful to see so many people who have taken time out from a beautiful August summer's afternoon here in Florida when you could be floating up to your neck in some body of water to try and beat the heat, but instead you chose to come to our air conditioning and enjoy and perhaps stretch yourself in the learning of a subject which should have been done a long time ago. We had a little conversation yesterday in the sanctuary as we were doing our discussion, as we do during each week, about how much we should be learning about God and how far we could be going, given the wisdom of our ancestors and the point of time that we now live in. 1,000 years ago, probably all but one of us in this room, if we were playing the odds, would spend most of our time battling hunger, battling cold, battling disease, and battling those that wanted to battle us, those that would fight and attack us. That would leave little time for the basic performance of the mitzvot, of the commandments, and our basic observance of our rituals, let alone the more elevated contemplation and the deep understanding of God. And yet, many of our ancestors found time to do so. They found time to devote themselves above and beyond the surface of our faith, above and beyond the basics of an understanding of God. And they reaped huge rewards for it. People often wonder, what is the secret to the longevity of the Jewish people? Why is it that we are still here? And obviously on one side, we're still here because God wants us to be here. But on the other side, one of the reasons for our continued existence is that our ways were not just folk ways, that we are not just some ethnographic blip on the anthropological timeline that just didn't realize it was supposed to die out in the late Bronze Age. That we have devoted ourselves not just to the keeping of the commandments, but to the understanding of them and the understanding of where they lead us towards in our connection to God. And that has been both the focus and our foundation for our enduring presence. Because you don't get to be 3,000 years old just because no one bothered to get rid of you. We all know people have tried to get rid of us. You don't get to be 3,000 years old because no one thought of just changing it rather than keeping on the way we had been keeping on, because we couldn't come up with a better idea. People came up with other ideas. I won't say better. People did come up with other ideas, other religions that were spun off, other philosophies that were created, that we examined, that we looked into, and ultimately we said, that's very nice, I hope you enjoy it, but we have something here that is special. And the thing that we have is special is not just our ethical code, it's not just our music and food, it's not just the study and the learning, but it is a spiritual connection to God. And yet every time I say that word God, I can tell by looking around the room and from countless discussions with people over the years, that when you say God, people don't know what in the world you're talking about. We use God as this placeholder for something that is incredibly important, and we never unpack what that placeholder is covering there on the page. We say Adonai, 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 or Elohim. We say God, we hyphenate it, we don't hyphenate it, we say Hashem. We come up with all of these words for God. And we never stop to unpack what they are trying to convey. That's what we're going to do today. I'm not expecting you to understand God when we start. is I don't think either the conservative movement or modern Judaism has done a very good job of conveying it, even though it should be easier now than ever. And I don't expect you to walk out here going, I see the light, I understand everything now, everything's perfect, no more questions to be asked, because it is really, really hard, and it doesn't happen in an hour and an afternoon. It takes 3 afternoons to master an understanding of God. And I don't pretend to be a master either. But I have walked away, and I do know which way the path heads, and I want to show you where it is pointing and help you to move further down it, to uncover the richness that it will give, and to see how it will transform your understanding of Judaism, life, and yourself. So I hope that's not too much of a hard sell. Let's get underway. All right, computer, don't fail me now. Hey, it's still going to do that every time, really? Okay, part 1. This week we are talking about God through the lens of creation. God's existence, why creation and science are not opposites, God's role as creator, and the importance of our knowing God as creator. Right? Not too much to go through for an hour, yes? Good. God's existence isn't like ours. If you walk out of here with no other message except this and what it means, I will still be happy. When we say God's existence isn't like ours, oftentimes we take that to mean God is better than us, God is greater than us, God is bigger than us, God is wiser than us, that God is longer lasting than us. All of those phrases are comparisons, and you cannot compare yourself to God. Not because you fall short, but because you're not even on the same scale. Right? If I say that Penelope is shorter than me, that's because we can both be measured in height. If I say God is bigger than me, is God measured along the same scale of size as I am? God is older than me? Is God measured in years? God is wiser than me? Do we measure God with an IQ? Hold your answers for that yet, because we're going to have to figure out how fundamentally God is different than us. Because it's not just about a lack of comparisons. We are made of atoms. We all sort of basically agree on this. And atoms, of course, are expressions of underlying quarks and subatomic particles, which in themselves are expressions of underlying patterns of energy, which happen to interact in a way that we take as being solid. That's your Physics 101 for today. Everything in the universe is made from this, either the energy that goes into it or the matter that materializes from that energy that we perceive as being solid. Everything is made from that. It doesn't matter whether you're a virus, you're a cat, whether you're not, or whether you are a star. Everything is made from this stuff. We all got that? No one's going to argue with me that we're all made of stuff? Good. Because God isn't. God is not made up of anything, right? Like a mosaic, we often think of God somehow as this diffused, amorphous cloud, right? The pictures of the heavenly clouds of photons, of tiny bits of light scattered throughout the universe. That somehow God is a particle that's not quite that I can see, but it permeates everything. Just like a mosaic, if you were really able to stand back, you'd see the whole thing, and that's wrong. God is not made of anything. Right? The mass of God is 0. God has no pieces. And by God has no pieces, I don't just mean that God has no material pieces that make him up, no atoms, no protons, no molecules or anything. I mean, God cannot be divided into the wisdom of God, the compassion of God, the justice of God. And we're going to come back to that concept later. But for the moment, just focus on the stuff. Everything in the universe is made of stuff. God isn't. Big difference? Yes? It should be. That's one of the most profound things that we need to realize. The second is that we exist in one place. Right now I am standing here. Now I am standing here. I do not stand in 2 places at once. I stand between them, but I'm not here and here simultaneously. Everything that it has a body, everything that is made of stuff, is fixed in a place. And it can move from place to place, what we call motion. Lovely picture of it. And when we move, we go further from one place and we get closer to another. Seems very basic, right? But this is how we function in the world. Everything moves. God doesn't. God can't move. Because in order to move, God has to be in a place. And in order to be in a place, God has to have a body. God has to be made of some stuff. If God is made of no stuff, then God does not exist in a place. And if God does not exist in a place, God cannot then move to another place. How are we doing so far? I lost everybody yet? Right? God is made up of no stuff, which means God does not move. God has no place. God has no location. There is no address, no GPS coordinates, no galactic information you can give. God doesn't have a location. Where's my mouse go? Okay. When we say that God is everywhere, and we hear this a lot, most of us kind of sort of think of God as being like air or light. As to say that God fuels all the spaces around us. That's not true. And I don't mean that's not true like, well, it's not so much or it's inaccurate. I mean, that is misleading, deceptive, and leads you back into thinking of God as having a body. Every time you try to use an analogy of God as a thing, you are opening yourself up for a potential problem. And we're going to talk about the issues of anthropomorphism, of how we do talk about God as having a body, and why we do, and why we should avoid thinking that way, even when we do. But if you want to think of God as being everywhere, don't think of it as God filling the universe like water filling a bowl. Think of God instead as being equally close to every single place in the world, every single place in the universe. Not because God is located here and located there and located there, but because God exists outside of it, and so distance is a meaningless measure when speaking of God. There's a little picture of somebody sitting there with 1,000 TVs pointing all over the world. From that person's point of view, they are in touch with the entire world. Right? If they could walk through the TV screen, they would be there. God is everywhere in that God is aware of everywhere. Doing okay? Okay. No stuff, no place. As Jeremiah points out, can a man hide himself in hiding places so I do not see him? Declares the Lord. Do I not fill the heavens and the earth? Declares the Lord. Sounds like filling. Right? The metaphor sounds like God is filling up all the space in between. Is that what the prophet was trying to convey? The philosophical truth that God is some amorphous, semi-material, ethereal force that has bits that we can't touch but are really there? No, that's not what the prophet was trying to say. What is the prophet trying to say in this verse? That you can't hide from God. Think of God as being everywhere so you will understand that God is aware of you, not because you will think that God fills the space around you. He uses the imagery of filling because it is evocative, because it conveys the sense of God's closeness, in this case for checking up on us, in many other cases for taking care of us, very, very well. But he wasn't trying to convey an idea of God's corporeality, of God having a body or being made of stuff, even if it's not in the shape of a body. Additionally, let me talk about us first. Additionally, we exist in time. I know this all sounds so obvious because that's how we live. But think for a moment, right? We exist here in a moment of now. And each second, we move further and further from our past. Ignore that arrow, by the way, it's misleading. Further and further from our past, and closer to the future. We don't get to change speed, and we certainly don't get to change direction. Right? This moment in time will never be repeated for us ever again. Nor that one, nor that one. We're doing okay so far? We all understand how time works and how it works. It's very, very clear. God doesn't work like that. God exists outside of time. There's no more radical notion of the difference between our existence of God, our existence and that of God, than this. God exists outside of time because time is a function of space, and God, as we already said, is not a thing that exists in space. So why would time affect God? Why would God be moving through time? Do you think God gets older with each day? Do you think God watches the passing of the sun? When we say God was there at the Big Bang, does that mean that the God who was there at the Big Bang is now 14 billion years older? Has God aged for every year since then? No, because God exists outside of the time, which is a function, which is a reflection of just being physical. And that means God doesn't have to sit around and wait to know what's happening next. Because God oversees, God exists as one unchanging, perfect God from the beginning to the end. Right? There isn't a God of Abraham that was a different God of Isaac. That was a different God of Jacob. There isn't a God that was there for Devorah or Miriam that is different from the God that we are experiencing. It's not like you saw your friend from college and then you didn't see him for 10 years and then you saw him again. And he's basically the same, but a little different. Water under the bridge, a little more gray on the top or a little bit less, as the case may be. That's not God traveling through time with us. God has already been at the end of the time, and God was there before time began. And God did not change at all in between. Doing okay with this? I know it's some heavy stuff, because it's so radically different than us, because that's what makes God God. Because nothing else in our existence or that could exist exists like God. If God did not have these attributes, if God did not have these characteristics, then it wouldn't be God. And we sing about this every single week, every single day if you're doing the daily liturgy as well. In a lovely little poem that everyone knows how to sing, and there's 1,000 different melodies for it. You can do it to the William Tell Overture, you can do it My Angel Was a Centerfold, you can do it to all sorts of traditional melodies. Adon Olam. Read the English sometimes if you don't know the Hebrew. But the first half explains it very well. Before all that was created was formed, when it was made by his will, then King will his name be called. God existed before anything else was made. It's not that God was sitting there floating in space, waiting for creation to happen. There was no space to float in. God exists in an entirely different way. And once God created space, created a place for the universe to unfold, God unfolded all of it simultaneously from beginning to end, because God exists unchanging from beginning to end. God has already seen the end of the universe. Come back to some of the implications of that, especially next week and the following week. After the end of all, alone he will reign in grandeur. When the universe goes boop, and disappears how many billion, trillion years, who knows, into the future, lots of theories, it will not affect God at all. The entire universe could wink out of existence tomorrow, and God would not be changed or harmed. Indeed, from God's perspective, the universe already has ended. Wrapping our head around this a little bit, right? God is unchangeable. No matter what we do, no matter what the universe does, God does not change. He was, he is, and he will be in splendor. Vehu haya, vehu hoveh, vehu yiheh, v'tifara. It's not just wonderful musical alliteration. It is one of the most profound statements of our belief, of our philosophy about God. As he said to Job and Job's friends, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell, if you know understanding. When he finally confronts Job about the injustice of the world, which will become a bigger theme in next week and the last week's session, He says, you weren't there when the universe was founded, because you are a product of the world. When the foundation was laid, I existed to draw the line. I existed to measure the seas. I existed to create what is here. You did not. Do you expect to fully understand me? Do you think your capacity from within inside this fishbowl of humanity, of the universe, lets you understand all that I do? Pretty sure that my fish at home doesn't understand me. God's existence isn't like ours. All right, into section 1. Ready for section 2, or do we have questions about that? God is not made of stuff. God has no motion, no place, no location, no movement, and God exists outside of time. And by outside of time, we don't just mean floating in the ether. It means God existed before, after, and during, unchanging throughout it all. Okay. So why do we have so many anthropomorphisms? Why do we talk about God coming down and God going up, about God sending forth, about God calling, about God regretting, about God getting angry, about God being pleased, about God smelling? Why do we have all of these statements which seem to indicate that God exists somehow in a way that we can relate to? As our text says over and over, the Torah speaks according to the language of man. And no, it's not just according to the gender-specific language. It's not just men who need this, but all of us need this. As Rambam goes on to point out in his inimitable way, the meaning of this phrase is that everything that all people are capable of understanding and representing to themselves at first thought has been ascribed as necessarily belonging to God. Attributes implying a physical body have been used for God in order to indicate that he exists, since most people cannot at first comprehend any existence save that of a physical body. That which is neither a body nor in a body does not exist in their opinion. As Rambam points out, if the Torah had come and begun with our slide 1 and tried to talk to you about God by saying God is not made of anything like you're made of, God has no location in space or time like you do, people would have said, well, I call something that has no location, no mass, and no existence in time, nothing. That's called nothing. I thought you wanted to talk to me about God. But instead, if the Torah talks to us about God coming down, of God having nostrils, every time it says God got angry, the literal idiom is God's nostrils flared. If it talks about God sending an angel, having some vision of some corporeal form of a throne, then people can relate to that. And once they relate to that, once they have connected to the basic idea, then slowly you can raise them from that idea to a higher understanding of God and leave behind the anthropomorphism, leave behind the imagery, leave behind the shell. We keep it for poetry, we keep it for joy, we keep it for the passion that it gives us. But we should never mistake the description that is using a physical idiom as describing the true reality or nature of God. Because if we do, we are only one step removed from idolatry. Because once you believe God has a body, once you believe that God has a location, has nostrils or hands or anything else, once you even believe that God can change his mind in a literal sense, not metaphorical, but if you do take it literally, you might as well build a statue. Because that's what everyone else did. As we say in Psalms 115, which is what we recite on Hallel, when we recite our joy at God's greatest acts of deliverance for our people. We sing it at the Seder table. We sing it for all of our other special holidays of redemption. Their idols are silver and gold. Woohoo! Right? The work of men's hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but they cannot touch, feet but cannot walk. What's the good of the physical representation of a God that doesn't exist? You give it eyes, You think that makes it so that the idol can see you? If you believe God has eyes, do you think that makes God closer? If you believe literally in the metaphor of God having a hand, how is that different than believing that my idol, who I carved hands for, can touch or help or do what I need? Instead, we are meant to, when we read this psalm, to realize the foolishness of the physical representation of any god, false gods and true gods. True God, I guess singular is more appropriate there. The anthropomorphism of idols seems like a good idea because it helps us relate, but it gets too easily carried away if we don't mature away from it. But we must graduate. God is the opposite of all those idols. God has no eyes, no mouth, no ears, but God can see. God can hear. God can speak. If you think that the physical representation is necessary to achieve the result, then you are misunderstanding what God needs. God does not need hands to take care of us. God does not need eyes to see us. God is more capable than any idol, even though God is less physical than any idol. It is precisely because God is not like anything else in this world that God is able to be God. Which often gets accused of being an apologetic. That this philosophy is somehow a response to the rising criticism from some in the scientific community who seek to criticize faith in the childish vision of a God who sits on a throne on a cloud with a big white robe and a big white beard, doling out justice or mercy as seems to suit him that day. That the literal images of God as some super being are made a mockery of by modern science. And somehow when we try to point out that, no, we don't really believe in a God like that, they accuse us of only coming up with apologetics. But the apologetics, as they call it, has been at the core of our faith since the first day, when there was no rational scientific method, when there was no exploration of the cosmology of the universe, when there was no discussion of evolution or of the age of our planet. We were already seeking the infinite before we knew we had to do so to apologize for anything. We were seeking it because it was true. We were seeking it because we felt that God was more than an idol. We felt that God was more than us. We felt that God existed in a way that was different than us, and that connecting to that existence in our own limited capacity would make our lives better. Again, that better part is much more involved in our next week and final week's discussion. Wait, I didn't read that one, did I? Let's make sure I covered that right. The biblical account of creation helps us to see both the meaning of the world and to glimpse God through it. Science, which is incredibly important, science, as opposed to certain scientists, help us to decide the physical laws of the universe, or decode rather. This lets us see the beautiful complexity, and it also gives us the tools to interact with the world according to our purpose. Without science, we cannot fulfill Torah. Without Torah, we would not know what to do with science. Without a godly purpose, we'd be just mundane particles bouncing through the void, and without the scientific tools, we'd be at the mercy of chance and brute force to try and shape the world in the direction of justice and goodness. We know that people are hungry, and we know that the Torah tells us to help them. If we didn't have science, would we know how to grow the food to help them? If we didn't have science, would we be able to improve our delivery systems? Because food grown in Iowa can reach people who live in places that have been struck by famine or hurricanes or disaster. We would not be capable of fulfilling all that Torah has asked us to do without the tools of science. They are not enemies. As Rambam said 1,000 years ago, before anyone thought this would be an important discussion, and what is the way toward love of Hashem and be in awe of Him? When a person contemplates God's great and wondrous acts and creations and perceives in them His indescribable and infinite vision, He immediately loves and praises and extols and experiences a great desire to know Adonai. The natural world and our exploration of it through rational thought and inquiry is an entry point for many and should be a point of celebration for all. The natural world is not in opposition to God. The natural world reflects God, because God made it. So let's get to God as the creator. The Holy One, blessed be He, looked into the book of Bereshit and created his world. Very famous quote from Midrash Rabbah, also quoted in the Zohar, the great book of Kabbalah. What does it mean to say that God looked into the Torah and then made the world? How could there be a Torah if there was no world? He unfolded a scroll in a place where there was no space. He unfolded a scroll thousands of years or billions of years before the words of the Torah would be committed to parchment. How in the world could the Torah precede reality? Well, there's a couple different ways that people often describe this. One, the simple meaning that's often used, is that God made the world in a way that would work with Torah. Right? So just imagine that Torah is the purpose of creation. If you want Torah to be successful, then at the point of creation, you're going to need to spit out all the things that are necessary for Torah's fulfillment. Right? The Torah talks about food, so you have to have food. You have to have organisms that need food. You have to have a system of creating food. You have to have the entire apparatus of the early and late rains. You have to have all of the things that are necessary for food to exist. So therefore, if the Torah is talking about food, we're going to need to have a food system in this universe. If the Torah talks about going up mountains, we're going to need to have mountains in this universe. Right? Very simple, very clear, very incomplete. Ethically, too, the world, according to this view, also allows us to fulfill the Torah's commands. I'd imagine if the Torah commanded you to be merciful, but you were physically incapable of acting with mercy because of some atomic or molecular barrier that would prevent you from doing so. That wouldn't be very fair. I'd imagine if you needed to live only by drinking water, which is true for all of us, but the Torah forbade water. The natural world wouldn't fit with Torah. So clearly the Torah has to work with the world. But the deeper meaning, the one I want you to walk away from here, is that the Torah is a reflection of God's unchanging will. The Torah is not just a book in the Ark. The Torah is not just a bunch of words on a parchment. We talk about Revelation much more tomorrow, much more next Sunday rather. But the Torah is not a book. The Torah is a reflection of God. The Torah is God made as real or clear as possible in this world. And it is more than the book we have on that shelf. God did not choose to use the Torah, as our simple meanings seem to imply, as a blueprint. Torah is an unavoidable reflection of God's essence and God's nature. Think for a moment. When you want to build a building, you design a blueprint, and then you build the building to match. Or you go back and change the blueprint to pretend like that's what you wanted in the first place. But there is a decision process, right? The architect or the contractor decides what they want the building to look like. And they have choices. Should we have bigger windows? Should we have smaller windows? Right? Should the roof be 10 foot, 20 foot, 30 foot? How do we want to build this? What do we want it to look like? And you make your choices based upon what you want it to do, what you want it to achieve, and how much someone else is going to pay you to do it. And this is all a matter of choice, of decisions. God had no choice. Right, let that sink in, because if that didn't sound radical, then you weren't listening. God had no choice. God, being what God is, had to create the world in a particular way. God is Torah. God is the instructions for this world. And the world could not have been otherwise, and God still be God. Remember, what's that?
Do that again.
Do that again. Okay, yeah. This one is very primary, because we went through the whole early stuff, right? God's not made up of atoms. God doesn't have a place in space. God isn't made up of time. Once you understand and accept those positions, once you understand that God is eternal and unchanging, that God exists in a scale and a way that is different than ours, not merely bigger, then you begin to understand that God is not making choices the way we make choices. That God's essence flows out, it emanates from God in a way that, as God is God, creates the world we have. And we're going to talk a lot more about free will. We're going to talk a lot more about God's interaction with the world when we get to our third segment in 2 weeks. But for the moment, that basic starting point, I need you to try and hold on to, as slippery as it is, that God is not, at the beginning of the world, sitting back and saying, you know what, I think I'd like a tree there. Maybe a mountain over here. The tree and the mountain had to come because God is God. And we don't understand always why that tree, that mountain, that lake is. We don't understand necessarily why gravity is an important aspect to have in our universe as a reflection of God's essence. But it must be, because apparently that's what was written in. And by the way, if anyone here actually understands what gravity is, there's a Nobel Prize waiting for you, because we still don't. I don't just mean we, the royal me, I mean we, humanity. Let's go on and get this out a little bit more. Reality is what it is, because it is in God's essence to create it as it is. Like God can no more create the world where gravity didn't exist than I could suddenly decide to be blue. Because I'm just not blue. If I were blue, I wouldn't be me. I have Blue Man Group notwithstanding. Its details and laws are built into its reason for existence and are a reflection of God's nature. Right? God wanted, and want is still a slippery word, but God wanted the universe to exist. Therefore, this is the universe that exists. And technically, and we're going to move past this because it gets too bogging down or mind-boggling, and technically God did not get to choose whether or not to create in the first place. But he did. So how do we understand this then? Well, we describe God's essence as reflected in creation and its commandments in human terms. Right? We talk about God, like the anthropomorphisms before, of a hand, of nostrils, and of a throne. We also talk about God ethically as being just. God is loving, God is merciful, God is powerful, God is wise. As though those were different things that were hanging off God. But they're not. They are emanations, they are outflowings, they are outgoings, they are a unified totality within God. We just, from our limited perspective here on the ground, perceive them as being separate emotions, separate ethical states. What we are meant to do is not to carve God up into those little strips and put them in different corners of our house, which is what idolaters did with their shrines, whereas to take their limited glimpse of the infinite and then wrap it around a statue and say, this is the statue of justice. This is the statue of abundance. This is the statue of war. They took those little bits of infinity that they could perceive and they carved them. We are supposed to ride them back to God. We are supposed to reflect that from our point of view, if another person did what God had done, we would call that just. If another person had done what God had done, we would call that mercy. But God is not divided by the adjectives that we label our limited perception of God's actions, although those labels are meant to guide our actions. Right? Because we're not God. We are divided as a bundle of emotions and of drives and of feelings and of desires. And so we use that bundle to guide ourselves, but we should never confuse the tool that God gave us because of the nature of our existence as applying to God's existence and God's nature. It doesn't work backwards. It only works then. Okay. A couple more examples on this. I recall a fire on a cold day inviting. Think about a cold day. That would be nice, right? But we call the fire inviting. We say, oh, I love the fire in the fireplace. It's so nice. It's so inviting. It's just calling me over to come and sit down and be warm. Or contrary, and perhaps more familiar, on a hot day, we might say, oh, the blessed mercy of the swimming pool. It's just, oh, please take me away. We ascribe to even inanimate objects, just casually, emotions and drives and purpose. But that's just their nature. The pool had no choice but to be merciful relief, and the fire will invite us closer whether it wants to or not. It's simply what it is. Their mercy and hospitality are built into their structure and how it affects us. God is God. And as God's emanations create and shape this world, again, much more of that next week and the following week, the mechanics, so to speak, we perceive its impact as being merciful, just, as being powerful, as being awe-inspiring, as being wise. But it's not that God is choosing one day to be merciful and the next day to be just and strict. It's not that God is choosing to be close one day and distant the other. Those are, to go back to our earlier discussion of the anthropomorphisms of hands and nose and feet, those are terms we use to understand our ambitions and goal in life to be just and merciful and compassionate, because that is part of the calling of being human. But they are not decisions that God is making day by day. Although we're going to talk much more about this on our final week, just a simple example of what this can do when you begin to grasp it. God did not choose to remain unmoved during the Holocaust. It wasn't, as you would say, for a human with power and grandeur that God just decided to stay on his chair. We'll talk about what God was doing during the Holocaust and a different way of looking at it than we often perceive. But it isn't something we can simply say, God didn't want to do anything. When it comes to creation, it is an unstoppable outpouring of God's essence. We label its curves and lines as mercy, justice, compassion, but they are all reflections of God, not individual emotions. Okay? Hopefully we've got that point covered. Moving on, right? Because if it weren't, then we have to say that God chooses, right? That God starts at point A, and he has to make thank you for that. And he has to make choice 1, or choice 2, or choice 3. And God has to decide of what to do today. So you're going to do 1, 2, or 3. And once he's decided 1, then 2 and 3 are now closed, and then he has to decide again, and he has to decide again, and he has to decide again. If this looks familiar, this is called human life. Right? Each day we are confronted with choices. But choice would require God to be able to be less than complete and perfect until the choice was made. But God is somehow unsure for even an instant what needs to be done. God, who exists outside of time and has seen the universe both begin and end simultaneously as far as God is concerned, needs to go through the process of a flowchart. The perfection of God, when we say God is wise, doesn't just mean God knows what to do. God knows what is done and knows what this universe should be to reflect his essence. We're going to introduce the whole free will thing in a minute. But for God, God has no free will. We do. God doesn't get to make choices. Because to make choices means that God could be if it's a choice, less than perfect. Because for it to be a choice, a real option, then that means God could pick the lesser choice. And if God could pick the lesser choice, then that means the potential for God to be imperfect would be real. And if God is imperfect, God isn't God. Right? Then God falls back into the universe as we know it. And there must be something that is perfect. Higher still. But don't worry, God is perfect and God is not going through the flow chart. God is what God is. It wasn't Popeye who invented I am what I am. Good way to remember it, but it wasn't Popeye who invented it. It was the book of Exodus. I am that I am. Yet I share yet. No more profound philosophical statement from 3,000 years ago exists in human history. For someone to recognize, someone being Moses, that there must exist an existence which is independent of all other existence, that exists without needing anything else, that is perfect and complete unto itself, and what that must entail. And by realizing that, by standing there and watching the bush that was not consumed, which is where this was up, to open the doorways in his mind to Adonai, to be able to receive the revelation that we would call Torah. This is the miracle of 3,000 years ago that created our people, and this is the miracle that has sustained us. Every year we read through this passage, and it just flows by, as though it's so obvious that God would say that what his true name was is, oh yeah, my name's John, nice to meet you, God. No, this is it. It's not easy, but this is it. If you understand this, you are blowing open the doors to the next level of understanding of God. The most perfect name of God that we refer to by Adonai holds this mystery in its 4 letters, right? The Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the He, which are connected to the Hebrew root for the word to be, for being. Because God is the only being that's essence does not depend upon some other being. Right? All of us in this room are dependent upon some other thing. And I'm not trying to call your parents things. I mean everything in the universe. Right? Without the sun, you don't exist. Without food, you don't exist. Without atoms, you don't exist. God doesn't have that list. God is entirely God without anything else. Before the universe was created, there was only the Almighty and his name. Why mention his name 2,000 years ago? I mean, really? There was God and he had a name tag. And that was it for all of eternity before eternity. Well, there was only the Almighty. The sentence could have ended there and the teaching would have been complete, right? No, if the sentence had ended there, we wouldn't have said anything interesting, because it is the name that is the secret that we are exploring. This sacred name marks something which is unique to God and is not found in any other being. It conveys the meaning of absolute existence. Absolute doesn't mean big, powerful, full. Absolute means perfect. The majesty of the name and the great dread of uttering it are connected with the fact that it denotes God himself, without including in its meaning any names of the things created by him. All of our other appellations, our terms for God, are references to God through this universe, right? Master of the world, Adon Olam, Ribono Shel Olam, the Lord of the world, right? The Almighty, the Lord, our Master, Adonai, the actual stand-in word that we use, rather than the true word for God's name. All of these are references to God through stuff. There may be stuff that's big and powerful and uplifting and inspiring, but it's still stuff. Only the name of Yud-He and Vav-He truly encapsulates God's essence as God. And that's why it is considered to be the doorway to God. That is why we have it in all of our blessings. It is why we call it out on our holidays. It is why it stands as the cornerstone of our philosophy, of our theology, of our faith, of everything that makes us Jewish. Not because God's name is catchy, not because God's name is interesting. It's not that our God is named this, and other gods were named Zeus, and other gods were named Baal. I sometimes joke with people that, the Yud-He, Vav-He, that's what God would sign his checks with. But I only use that joke to point out that this is uniquely God's name, whereas all other references we use are shared at one point or another by either humans or by other deities of the ancient world. Only this name is unique in our text for God and God alone. Why would this name be unique? Because only this name reflects the uniqueness of God in comparison to all existence. All right? If you view God as picking and choosing, if you view God as deciding throughout creation and history, then you make God into a powerful but still limited being who operates by the same rules as us. And by the way, Superman was Jewish. By the way, what was Superman's name? Clark Kent was his birth name. Kal-El. El. What's El mean in Hebrew? God. But does it mean God? God? Or can it be both capital G and lowercase g? It can be both, right? The word El in Hebrew can mean God, capital G, as we would say in English. Or it can mean the gods that are over there in somebody's household shrine. It's like the English word God. You can use it to mean the God, or you can use it just to mean things that are treated like gods. And many of us still treat God as being Kal-El, right? As being like Superman. That God is immensely powerful. God is immensely wise. God is immensely compassionate. But that's just us made bigger and better. That's not different. It may be what we were used to in the ancient world when we looked at our rulers and our leaders and those that we would look up to. The king was a lot richer than me. A billionaire and a pauper may live very different lives, but they are differences of scale. The only thing separating them is quantity, not inherent qualities. Right? Something, if you've ever watched the Trading Places, the lovely Dan Aykroyd, Eddie Murphy movie, hopefully will drive home. You swap the prince and the pauper, another good version of this. What do you get? Is the pauper unable to be the prince? Is the prince somehow going to magically rise over the situation of being the pauper? No. It's just a difference of how much of whatever it is you're comparing each one's got. But they're inherently the same thing. We and God are not. And treating God like some supernatural super being, treating God as being the love child of Superman and Casper the Friendly Ghost, is another form of idolatry. And another form that will lead you into mental breakdown if you bother to consider the implications as an adult, or will lead you to disregard religion altogether. Because to try and be an adult with that conception of God, well, if you're being honest with yourself, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And we should always be honest with ourselves. All right, so what? So why does this matter? Think of God as a power beyond our universe that gives it its shape and texture. And you'll realize some things eventually. I'm not saying this is going to happen in the next 5 minutes. Right? That every piece of creation sings of God. Every single atom and molecule is a poem to God. We say it every single day. All that breathes, praise the Adonai. Hallelujah. All right, from Psalms 150. Hopefully you remember the melody, right? The skies declare the glory of God, and the heavens show God's handiwork. From Psalms 19. Right? Everything about us reflects God. Following the mitzvot, when you conceive of God in this way, is not about obeying the laws of a ruler, but of matching the fabric of reality with our actions. Right, again, go back to our discussion of anthropomorphism. We use the terms Avinu, we use the term Malkeinu, our father, our king, because that is something that is immediately accessible from the youngest person in the room. Youngest both in age as well as in spiritual maturity. And Judaism needs to be accessible to everyone. Right? Judaism is not the religion of the guru. Judaism is not the religion that is only for one who has climbed to the top of the mountain. Judaism is there from everyone from the first moment they can open their mouth. Just had our first day of school, and we had some lovely kids here today that are very, very tiny. And they were enjoying their Judaism. And they were singing, and they were dancing, and they were learning. But it doesn't stay there. Right? If you grow up and you only think of God as being a king, you only think of God as being a father, and you never stretch yourself to think of God as being more than that, you are doing a profound disservice to God. And you are doing a profound disservice to yourself. A, because you may begin to wonder, I'm doing a sub-A, I guess. A, because you may begin to wonder, why am I bothering to follow these commandments by some king I've never met? I'm guessing that most of you would be a little uncomfortable following the edicts of some random person who came along and said, oh, by the way, I'm your king, and I'd like you to go paint your house pink. Who are you? What are you? You're no king of mine. And as an adult, we'd eventually, if we were examining this clearly, come to perhaps reject the mitzvot if that was the only depth we had in our connection and understanding of God. But more, the breaking of the mitzvot is akin to the breaking the laws of motion or gravity. Right? We're not just breaking a commandment. We didn't just fail to live up to some expectation of some king from 3,000 years ago who gave us a book that, for whatever reason, we're still following. When you fail to keep a commandment, either by breaking it or failing to live up to it, when you're not merciful, when you're not honest, when you treat someone with anger or disdain, when you, yes, violate Shabbat or Kashrut, all of the things that go into Torah, you're not just messing up your scorecard with the phantom scorekeeper. You are running the wrong direction against the current of the world. Doesn't always feel like that right away, and we're going to talk about that more again next week and the following week. There's a reason why there are 3 parts. But eventually the universe will correct your error because that's how it operates. By going back to our initial premise, if the universe is as it is because it is a reflection of God's will, if the universe is as it is because Torah, meaning God, could only make it as this, then what Torah says isn't just nice advice and suggestions. It is the ultimate hacker's code book to how to get by in this world as the creatures that we are. And you can ignore the instruction manual as much as you like, but eventually you're going to break something. Right? Same thing for any other instruction manual, by the way. You can get by a long time without reading the instruction manual, but eventually you're going to break something, or you're going to miss something, or you're going to miss out on something because you didn't bother to read the manual. And you may think you're doing fine, but you're missing it. A few years ago, there was a survey of people who had purchased iPads. This was just after they had come out. And about 6 to 12 months later, they were doing a survey, and they found that 75% of the people who had bought them had never installed another app, because most of them didn't know how. But they loved their iPad, right? Because it could do so much. And I always wondered, for the surveyors, while they were asking their questions and jotting down the responses, after the person had told them that, did they stop and say, you know, I got to tell you, there's so much more you can be doing with this thing. I know you love it and you're happy with it, but let me just show you what you can do. Right? Well, tell me what you like. Oh, you like cooking. Oh, let me show you how you can get some recipes in here. Or you like traveling. Let me show you what you can see here. Let me show you what you can do if you just read the manual. If you just take the time to figure out how this thing works. Right? Because the punishment for the failure to fulfill the mitzvot is not punishment at the hand of heaven that a giant lightning bolt or asteroid is going to smack you. The punishment is you're missing out on the life you could be leading. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. Free will may let us deviate from the shape of the world, but ultimately God's structure will bring the world to redemption. And again, the world is created as an expression of God. Ultimately, it will get to its final godly state. Free will both creates that as well as prevents that. That is to say, free will is a necessary component for that final state. Again, more to come later. But free will also delays it, but it cannot prevent it from happening permanently. And ultimately, the world will be a perfect reflection of what it is meant to be. All of creation, from the first seconds after the Big Bang to this point, from DNA to tectonic plates, from quarks to black holes, flow from the purest essence of God to create this world, where spirit and matter can mingle and be transformed through conscious choice. That's something we can do here that we couldn't do if we were like God. And it's something that God can't achieve without us. I'll let that hang there for a second, because I know that there were many people during the Middle Ages who loved to argue over what God can and can't do, or whether there was such a thing as God couldn't do. There are things God can't do. God can't be imperfect. God can't change. But God created a world that is capable of spiritual transformation, capable of taking what we call the soul and transforming it through its choice, something which we've described God doesn't have in the way that we mean the word choice, and making itself better. Sound a little like Judaism? And we always talk about making yourself better, making the world better, perfecting the world. And we use it in very loose terms. And that's great because it gets people to do what they ought to be doing. But understand the magnificence of what you're doing. You are moving spirit in a way that can only be achieved by human free will, by conscious choice. You are taking what is generally considered non-transformable, the essence of spirit, and you are making it better than it was. That is something that God can't do without our free will. Now, ultimately, our free will lead in cooperation with God to a world of redemption. But you're going to have to hold on for that for a couple more weeks. So mitzvah aseh, this is the third mitzvah in the list of mitzvot that Rambam lists. We should think about and contemplate God's mitzvot and statements and actions until we attain an understanding of God and experience an ultimate pleasure in that attainment. Rambam doesn't just say you should be doing the mitzvot because it's the will of your king. Although, by the way, that is a synonym for what he has said here, if you understand will and if you understand king properly. But Rambam makes it a little bit clearer while making it harder. That when you are performing the mitzvot, you should see them as a path to God, a path to understanding God, and to enjoy that level of the experience, to savor the attainment of pleasure that comes from the performance of something which is in harmony with the nature of this world, which is in itself an outpouring of God's essence. Every action that you do that is in keeping with Torah, remember that's Torah writ large, It's an action that moves you closer to God if you notice your change in position. And is an action that moves this world closer to God, if you are willing to acknowledge that. You are an expression of God's essence. Remember? You were created too. And the culmination of billions of choices made by your ancestors. And your choices will create a future for your own spirit beyond this world, and a world for those who follow. From God's point of view, that's already happened. God's already seen how it's played out. And in total, it's good. Right? The world is good. That's what the first book of Genesis tells us. Our decision is simply how good it will be for us. That's our choice. Because that's how God made us. All right, that ends the formal presentation. Now comes, I'm accessing some questions. It's heavy. Of course it's heavy. Of course it's heavy. It's not a light and fluffy topic. Right? Judaism is not just fun. It is so much more than that. Think of it, if you will, the difference between having hookups and having a loving relationship with a spouse. Right? Someone might think, I'll do anybody, anywhere, anytime. If it feels good, I'll do it. Consensual adults, etc., etc. Those of you that have a loving relationship with a spouse, would you trade vicarious momentary pleasure for that relationship with your spouse? Or would you say, no way? Because I have experienced an understanding and a depth of pleasure that comes from moving in harmony with this person that far exceeds the momentary thrill that comes from some sexual liaison alone. And by the way, you can have the other two who are not celibate, right? And so too with God. Right? Oftentimes we treat Judaism almost as it were a dating bar. Right? You come in, you do a mitzvah, you feel good about it, you go home, and you forget about it, and you don't call the next day. Right? You come in, you have a lovely Shabbos dinner, it's a nice experience, but you don't really stick around to get to know the host, meaning God. Right? You read some Torah, you pray a little bit, it feels nice for the day, I feel better, now I can go back to doing my non-Jewish stuff and not worry about God or think about it or anything like that. Yes, you can live like that, and yes, it does help you, and it does help Judaism, and it does help the world. That's one of the brilliant pieces that God built into the universe, is that you don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to be on target, and you don't have to be philosophical and theologically enamored of all of this all the time. But why wouldn't you when you could? Right? Again, just like a loving relationship with a spouse, it doesn't mean that you are holding hands and gazing longingly into each other's eyes 24/7. You're going to have to sleep, you're going to have to eat, you're going to have to do other things. But you should also make sure you have time for the holding the hands and gazing longingly into each other's eyes, if you really want to understand the relationship. Do that with God as well. Anthropomorphism notwithstanding. Any other questions for today? I know it was a lot to throw out, and did it in just over an hour. And there's a lot more coming next week and the following week. Right.
But we,
Correct.
So is this like, what was that? Was that just it's coming?
That was next week. So next week, so let me give you a little breakdown for what's coming, right? Because essentially what I took the framework for this three-part presentation from our daily prayers, because we do this every single day in our prayers. We recognize God as creator in Yotzer or Mariva Ravim, in the opening prayers of our Shacharit or Mariv service. We recognize God as Revealer, the one who gave us Torah, and what that means in Ahava Rabbah or Ahavat Olam, depending if it's morning or night, and that's next week. Is talking about what we mean when we talk about Torah and revelation and the people who came before Moses and the people who came after Moses. What were the prophets doing? What are our sages doing? What are we doing? Is there any revelation left for us? And that's next week. And then the prayer that comes after the Shema, which talks about redemption. The following week, that's the week right before Rosh Hashanah, we're going to be discussing God as an actor. Because this is God as a creator, but as far as this is concerned, God could have turned the keys and walked away and left the universe idling. 2 weeks from now, we're going to be talking about how God is still involved in the world. That'll be challenging, because there's a lot of times when it doesn't feel like that's the case. And I'm not going to paper over. That one's going to be a lot rougher than this discussion. But to get there, we have to understand Revelation first. And that, I'm not going to say will answer your question. It will address your question next week of what do we make of the foreshadowing of Torah that happens from all the people before Moses comes along. Okay?
Who says that Torah is the instruction manual for understanding this ununderstandable, unrelated effect?
So there's two answers to that. One is, first of all, don't think that the Torah is the only method for understanding. Right? I'm not saying go out and explore all the New Age thing that you feel like, or run off to some other faith. Torah is, I believe, and has been argued, I think, quite powerfully for a few thousand years, is the best method for understanding and attaining a connection to God, in particular for Jews. And there are truths within it that are open to everyone of the world. But other people have, and this will come back to our discussion of Revelation next week, other people from other faiths or faith traditions or cultures have also encountered the same truth. They don't wrap it always in the same language. They certainly don't always reflect it in the same actions. But you will find enough commonality among those that have perceived God with any degree of clarity that we can understand that we are all looking at the same thing. Culture, politics, history often bury and blur those moments of perception, which is why even when you read the classical texts of many of the world's faiths or ancient philosophers, it doesn't bear much resemblance to the modern application. That shouldn't make us think, just because we are witness to the modern application, that others too have not tried to glimpse the infinite and have done fair work at doing so. And so part of the reason why I believe Torah is true as this foundation for us understanding the unknowable is because others have come to similar conclusions in entirely disparate cultures and societies and times. And it surprises me to imagine that they would all be answering so similarly a call that didn't exist. That they were all making it up in very similar ways if there wasn't something that they were all being pulled towards. Yes, the waters get muddy and things have often deviated wildly from some of the initial teachings of many faiths as well as philosophies. And some have been lost to time, some of the teachings that were out there, and some of them were not repeatable by large groups of people, and so were lost to an individual. Again, much more on this next week. The other answer of why we think the Torah and Judaism works is because it works. The old adage, nothing succeeds like success, right? 3,000 years, we have not been kept alive by bagels. 3,000 years, we have not been kept alive by our kishkas, either our kishkas or our kishkas, whichever way you want to translate that word. It's not just because Hebrew poetry is nice. It's because what inspired the Hebrew poetry. It's not just because the mitzvot make us feel good. They make us feel good for a reason. Because it is our soul connecting to this universe in a way that doesn't happen if you don't have a path towards this infinite. Right? The soul yearns to be close to God. The body yearns to stay alive another day. Judaism balances those two. Right? We don't go off, like I said, and climb to the top of a mountain and become some guru who starves himself to death to have a vision of the divine. We live in the world, we build the world, and we make the world wonderful in that process, and we transform ourselves in the process. And we have done it countless times. You've seen or read Harry Potter? Okay, so third book, right? Prisoners from Azkaban. And spoiler alerts, if you haven't seen Harry Potter, leave the room. Don't worry, it's not really worth it. But there's a great scene, in it involving time travel, where Harry is staying at a lake and there are these horrible spirit things called Dementors coming at him. And he pulls out his wand and he's trying to cast a spell that will make them go away. It's a spell of light and goodness and all of this, and will make the evil, bad, chilly things disappear. I mean chilly like cold, not chilly like others. And he fails horribly. And as they swarm over him and begin to kill him, he collapses to the ground. He sees across the distance, he sees what he thinks is his father, who's dead, right? Cast the very spell he was just trying to cast, and this huge light stag comes charging across the lake to his rescue. And he thinks, my God, my father is still alive, it's wonderful. And when he goes around searching for him, and they use this time travel, and he goes, oh, now I can go meet my dad, and I'll see him here. And so he goes and he stands on the opposite side of the lake from where he was when he was dying. Remember time travel, it's a book, deal with it. And as he stands there, his dad isn't there. As he stands there, there's nobody, and he realizes it was him that saved him in the past. And he does the spell, and it's amazing and wonderful, and everything goes away, and the special effects are nice. And his friend says, well, how could you do it this time, but the last time you couldn't? He says, because this time I knew I already could. Because I'd watched myself do it the first time when I was dying. Now I knew I could do it. Right? We know Judaism works because we've seen others do it. We know that Judaism has led thousands and thousands of people to a spiritually rich life, not just a culturally or ethically solid life. When you read the classics of our tradition, not just the poets and the mystics, but when you read the classics of the Mishnah, of the Talmud, when you read the beauty that is expressed in the joy of connecting to something that is infinite through the observance of the commandments and through the study of our Torah, you recognize that these people are not just all pretending. And I can tell you from personal experience, which is the only experience I can truly attest to, it works. Again, I'm not talking 24/7 staring longingly into the eyes of the infinite, but we are talking more and more moments of insight, of connection, and of just feeling an understanding of how things are. And that comes through Judaism when you're looking for this side of it in a way that doesn't happen when you just stare at a sunset. You get a little bit of it. But Judaism gives it a framework and a direction, and it works. So that's the long answer to the question. So it's not that Judaism is an exclusive pathway to God. God forbid we believe that the righteous and others of the world have both a share in the obligation as well as a share in the reward that comes from this. And we'll talk more about that notion of reward and what it means to carry what we have done in this world on to the next. But Judaism is ours. It's our home, and it works uniquely well for us. And before anyone goes looking anywhere else, which unfortunately many do, I'm always very sure to try to make them understand that Judaism is a deeply spiritual path if you try to follow what it was meant to be. Graduate, grow up. Don't be satisfied with your understanding of God that you had when you had your bar mitzvah. Don't be satisfied with the understanding of God you had when you maybe walked away from Judaism or things in college. Not be satisfied even with the perhaps warm compromises you made for yourself when you were raising your own children. And you didn't really sort of absolutely believe in God because you weren't sure what that really meant anyway. But you knew it was kind of important for your family, and it really, helped bring people together, and it was teaching good values to your kids as well. Graduate from that. Step up. You can do better. All of us. This is not the path for the elite. This is the path for those who want to seek God. And one of the greatest gifts that Judaism gave us is to say that path is open to everyone. You just have to walk it. Anything else today? Or we'll save them for next week, or private conversation. All right, thank you very much.